we're here today with Austin Kocher and the other guy, Matt.
Yeah.
You guys, we're going to get to some immigration stuff, but I did want to say I watched the hearing last night, some of it, not all of it, on the January 6th event. But then today I got
It was a dust up.
the dust up.
Yeah.
On the way to work, I was listening to the local talk radio, and they had some really good points, which is that actually Pelosi and Schumer and Nadler, and also our cuck Republican congressman who voted for impeachment, they all let the protesters in. They let it happen because they knew that it would they could use it to own Trump. And I hadn't thought about it this way. And
I think the Antifa and BLM crowd that was like mixed in,
right,
just really instigated the whole thing. I think it was pretty clear from the videos. I didn't watch the videos,
right,
but that's what I understand. Like there were some people with beards, like Antifa tends to wear beards.
It was them for sure.
Yeah, and there were some people. I saw people dressed in black.
Yeah,
two beard guys. Right, I'm staring right at two beard guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The conspiracy goes deeper than I thought. I mean, it's crazy that Nancy Pelosi Jedi mind tricked Donald Trump into saying that he thought it would be good for Mike Pence to get hung and murdered. Isn't that crazy that she knew that if she could get Trump to say that it would make Trump look bad. And so she tricked.
That's what living in San Francisco will do to you.
Mm-hmm. It's those San Francisco values.
She's originally from Baltimore. Do you guys know that?
Really?
Didn't know that.
Very interesting. Huh. Well, guys.
Oh, typical East Coaster trying to move to the West Coast and pass off as a left coast liberal elite. Man, if the Democratic Party, was that successful at three-dimensional chess, do you think they'd have so many issues winning midterm elections and passing policies?
I love that. That's such a good point because they lose to the host of The Apprentice. But then they're so sophisticated that 4 years later, they're able to trick Trump into saying the election was stolen to instigate an insurrection so that they could then use it against him, I think. Anyways, the point is the election was stolen.
Just eating right out of their hand. Trump was just eating right out of Nancy Pelosi's hand. Man, got him right where we want him.
Yeah, I feel bad for him. I feel bad.
For Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why because he got bamboozled.
Yeah. Poor guy.
Matthew, I just saw your tweet about the word shenanigans. Can you share this story real quick?
So I'm working on this appeal. It's an appeal I took over from someone. And in short, part of it is the woman who was denied asylum. Her partner was in the MS-13. And so the judge is describing what's going on in the household. A lot of bad stuff, violent stuff. And then says the respondent, which is this woman who's claiming asylum, overheard this guy, MS-13 member, plotting with his friends about their shenanigans.
Right.
So these are MS-13 members they're just plotting shenanigans. Just I guess they're even people wedgies, smacking their hats off of people, stealing fruit from the vendors,
Giving the mayor a swirly.
like the January 6th shenanigans.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I wonder if Nancy Pelosi tricked this guy into engaging in these kinds of shenanigans.
She describes, and I won't get into it because a lot of it is kind of disturbing, what they were actually doing. And then the judge is like, shenanigans. I'm like, it's just...
Let's be clear. I think MS-13 at times could be engaged in shenanigans. But what you're suggesting is maybe it was murdery stuff.
Murder, assault.
Murdery.
Things like that. I mean, sure, did they give their victims wet willies from now and again?
Right.
Possible. That's possible. Right? I wasn't there. Right. So I don't know.
It is interesting. We should have a whole episode. This is an interesting point because I studied Spanish translation and interpretation. So I took a lot of like language classes, and it would be interesting to do a show on like the language of immigration and immigration court and the way that words are used to sort of soften certain things that happen. I mean, that's like an absurd example, but I'm sure it happens all the time,
Well,
right?
There was this one judge in Philadelphia who's kind of an and one of my colleagues was telling me about this, where her client was testifying to have been being raped repeatedly by her domestic partner, but she wasn't saying raped, right? She was saying he would force me to do things I didn't want to do. Then he would force me to have relations. And the judge kept pressing her until finally she had to say, yes, he raped me. And then the judge was satisfied. Like, everyone knew what she was talking about. And most judges are better than that. Most judges will, okay, you can talk around it. We understand. But I don't know, he got some weird pleasure, I guess, in having this woman testify that she was actually raped and not just forced to do things she didn't want to do in the marital bed. I mean.
Right. Now we should bring in Austin. Austin, the last time we spoke, we were talking about how
I wasn't invited.
Matthew wasn't here. It's our highest rated episode ever. And we were talking about how alternatives to detention, like electronic monitoring and the use of either ankle monitors or phone apps where people have to take pictures of themselves and report on a regular basis, even though they're coined as alternatives to detention, they're actually in addition to detention, because detention remains, and then this is on top of that. So that was months ago, and I'm sure that the Biden administration has had plenty of time to fix it. So are you prepared to apologize for the fear mongering that you brought to the show months ago, now that it's fixed?
Yeah, it was really, I really spoke out of turn. I should have waited to see them almost double the number of people even since then on alternatives to detention. Yeah, it keeps growing.
They doubled it, but of course that was because they released everyone from detention and put them on that, right?
And now there's no more detention. Yeah, that's right. I don't know if you've heard, I don't know if you've seen all the reports across the country of all these detention centers being essentially dismantled because we don't need them anymore. So it's really nice. It's great, actually. It's been amazing.
Mm.
So I think we can kind of wrap it there, right?
Great success. Yeah, so that's not happening. Detention is still happening. Is that correct?
Yeah. We track these numbers really closely, and they just released new numbers yesterday. It was initially a tough thing to talk about because detention numbers have been kind of low relatively because of the pandemic and all of this. And when we talked back in February, I've told other people this, everyone should listen to Redirect because we were talking about alternatives to detention on here basically in March and April. All this alternative to detention stuff broke through the news cycle, and there's been a ton of reporting, but Redirect talked about it first, right? So they just released new numbers yesterday, and the detention numbers, which had been relatively low, are on their way back up. So the detention numbers have been around 20,000, sometimes a little bit less than 20,000 at a time. And now it's back up to almost 25,000 just in the last couple of weeks. At the same time, that alternatives to detention is now at 266,000 people being monitored on that program. So what we're seeing right now is basically the number of people in detention is growing and the number of people on quote unquote alternatives to detention is growing. And I've actually tried to make a point of not calling it alternative to detention anymore. I just call it electronic monitoring. It's ICE's electronic monitoring program. It isn't an alternative to anything. As you said, it's in addition to detention. And I think changing the language around that will help, I think, dispel some confusion.
Now, Stephen, have you ever had anyone released from detention to be put on electronic monitoring, like someone who wasn't going to be released. I've asked for it before. So I've asked, hey, I know this person is subject to mandatory detention or whatnot. Would you consider releasing them and putting them on an ankle monitor or something, at least, so they can spend time with their family, or maybe their wife is having a baby or whatnot? Never.
Right.
Zero. I'm 0 for 1,000, whatever it is.
Right.
I'm sure you're more successful, Stephen, right?
Well, it is interesting because since I started practicing, the amount that they require for a cash bond to get someone out has gone through the roof. So I remember my first bond hearing like this. I'm showing the graph with my hands. I asked for a bond of $5,000 and the judge was like, sure. And I felt kind of bad that I hadn't asked for less. And now a $5,000 bond, especially in circumstances of, the circumstances of that case, it would easily be $15,000. And there aren't a lot of immigration bail bondsmen who, like in criminal court, you can pay 10% and a bondsman will cover the rest. And there's not a lot of programs like that for immigrants, and to the extent they exist, they're highly predatory. And so that means a farm working family has got to come up with 15 grand to get somebody out. And so I remember, Matthew, you were the one who actually turned me on to this idea of like, well, you can go to the judge and say they can only afford 7, but how about an ankle monitor? Like, not ideal, but these are tools that are at the disposal of every local ICE office. And not only has the judge never used those tools as a sort of a mitigating factor to reduce the bond, but the ICE attorneys have never asked for it themselves or seen it as a tool that they can use, which is interesting. Most of the people I have on electronic monitoring are like asylum seekers who at this point have been waiting for a hearing 2 or 3 years, and they continue to have to send their picture and be geolocated every week to the local ICE office. And since we've had a change in enforcement priorities where they're sort of going after less people, they're filing less notices to appear with the court, I've tried to negotiate with the local ICE office, like, hey, this lady's been checking in for 3 years. Every week. She's got an attorney. We filed the application. Like, what can we get her off these check-ins? And I've been told over and over again, no, that it's still super important that they monitor Maria in Othello, Washington, or whatever, a town of 10,000 people, because she might commit the grave crime of picking onions or something.
So they're articulating that as a way of not just monitoring, but actually disciplining and influencing routine behavior, specifically labor force related stuff.
That's certainly how it's being interpreted by my clients. Yeah. And I'm sure that that's what's being communicated. Like, if you don't have a work permit, and, we're going to be able to tell that you're working. And so you better be sitting at home for however long it takes you to get a work permit, which can be a long time.
Right.
Yeah. And interestingly, we had a case where this family came in, they were issued notices to appear in the immigration court. One notice to appear was filed for, maybe I told this story already, was filed for the dad. But then with the change of administrations, litigation made the decision not to file the notices to appear for the rest of the family, even though we asked them to, because it's a family unit, like they came together. And so the wife and the kids are not even in removal proceedings. And when I contacted ERO to say it's absurd that you would continue to monitor them if litigation says they're not even going to be removed, they refused to take them off the monitoring. So even within ICE, you have these disparate parts that don't seem to agree on some pretty basic stuff. Yeah.
Interesting.
But also, why is that? Why is the reliance on this? What motivates this?
Well, I guess it's two things that I think is driving the trend. One is I think that the Biden administration, like many Democratic administrations, thinks that if they do a little bit of stick and a little bit of carrot, that their Republican counterparts are going to see that, oh, they're trying to be really reasonable. We can work with these people. And so instead of paroling people into the country and allowing them to just go to their hearings, they're saying, oh, well, we'll let them out of detention, but we'll monitor them. That'll be okay, right? That'll be politically something that people can tolerate. We don't live in that world anymore. And I think for President Biden to think that that is the world we live in is just sort of outdated. But I also think that it's not just the Biden administration. I think it's also ICE for a long time. They've always articulated, basically since the early 80s, they've articulated detention and its quote unquote alternatives to detention, its ISAP program, as something that they need to make sure that everybody goes to their hearings and that everybody leaves the country when they're supposed to. And the data on whether or not this is actually the case and this solves the problem is not at all consistent with that narrative. But I think the way to think about it in a simple way is ICE really does want pretty total control and access to everyone that's in the country who is not a US citizen, you know? And that's, I think, really what's animating this program.
Can I offer another reason?
Oh, yeah, there's multiple reasons. So there's plenty. Please do.
Money, right? I mean, this is a money grab for these companies. And
so cynical.
You know, and I'm quite sure if you look into the upper reaches of these companies, you'll find a lot of ex-ICE. I'm just guessing. I have no idea.
Oh, there's no question. No, I have looked into this. There's a lot of back and forth. In fact, the people who started what's now called Core Civic, they started out in government, working in government, and then moved into government contracts for private detention centers. Their headquarters is in Nashville. Geo Group is actually the company that owns the subsidiary that runs the Alternatives to Detention program. They're in Florida, not that far from Mar-a-Lago, actually. So the company that runs the electronic monitoring program, ICE's ATD program, is called BI Inc. Its headquarters is out in Colorado, and they got the contract for this back in 2003. They continue to hold the contract and run the program. But in 2011, the Geo Group, which is basically the world's largest private detention contractor in the world, they have detention centers all over the world, bought up BI for close to $500 million because they saw this contract with ICE as very lucrative. It is the most recent contract. ISAP 4 is worth $2.2 billion. And it's pretty well documented. If you go back to the early 2010s, a lot of these private contractors, they saw the writing on the wall that eventually the tides were turning and people across the political spectrum were kind of getting fed up with mass incarceration and the numbers of people held in cages, and said, okay, well, in addition to investing in these private facilities, we actually need to diversify our portfolio. And we see that this quote unquote alternatives to detention kinds of technology, electronic monitoring, is kind of the wave of the criminal justice and also the immigration enforcement future. And so they invested early, and that's paying off with lots of contracts. By the way, they're not the only ones. There are a ton of private contractors that have popped up in the last 5-6 years getting in on the money. I mean, there's ankle monitors, there are wrist bracelets, there's these smaller ankle bracelets that are, you know, they're even less clunky and they try to make them look more acceptable. There's a whole litany of smartphone apps now. There's a watch, a GPS watch that one of the companies puts out. So absolutely, this is an entire area of industry right now. And one last point about this, what's driving now? I tried to characterize what I think is driving the numbers with the administration and with ICE, but you're absolutely right. I think that there's a big profit motive here. And by the way, it's not just the technology and the contracts. A key thing for people to sort of really understand is that these technologies gather massive amounts of personal and personalized information, which there is a giant data market for. It's called data brokering. And companies scoop up these massive amounts of data and information. They sell them on the private market, or they pump them back into various data pools around the country for law enforcement agencies. And this is essentially this whole secondary market for electronic monitoring is data sharing. There was just a report that came out yesterday that, you know, showed that Immigration and Customs Enforcement has paid into these data brokering services, and they ran something like 1.2 million searches in the last 7 months basically searching these data brokering companies like LexisNexis that scoop up all of yours and mine and everyone's water bill records, our college degrees, like all of this personal information, and make it searchable for law enforcement. So it's part of a really big and I think a really troubling trend.
I mean, with Stephen, a government official would never misuse personal data from immigrants, right?
I mean, that would be wrong. So I'm going to assume that they wouldn't. I saw this story about the data gathering and how it goes beyond immigrants. Mm-hmm. Not that it should need to for us to care, but it didn't really seem to matter to most people. The story wasn't registering, and there could be a million reasons for that. But one thing I'm wondering about, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but like maybe we just are beyond caring about privacy. Everyone has a cell phone now, and we all sort of understand. I feel like that we've kind of forfeited privacy interests in exchange for like being able to see people from high school and like how much weight they've gained or whatever dumb things we're doing on I should take that example out because that's not something I do, obviously. But we've decided that the benefit of Facebook and social media and the convenience of a Maps app outweighs, it's not registering to people like why this matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so do you think we're just sort of beyond giving a about, oh yeah, the federal government, they know everything about me? And if we are beyond that, like what do we do to get people back into like, hey, this matters?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something that, that I think about a lot with respect to this, because I want people to care about privacy and data sharing and information sharing. I think one of the key distinctions here is that, okay, there is obviously a huge issue with all kinds of things our apps are doing that we either don't know or we've accepted the terms of service and without reading anything, and we just sort of given up. However, at least within that ecosystem, we have, I agree with you. A lot of us have decided, okay, I'm going to allow my phone to access this information because I get some benefit out of it. I can connect to my friends on social media. I can get directions to work when I need to go to work. And so we've sort of evaluated those trade-offs, and we might say, well, those trade-offs are asymmetrical. The companies are getting a lot more from you than you're getting from them. So you might make that argument. That's a very different argument, I think, than knowing that there is a federal agency like ICE, who is ostensibly supposed to be doing immigration enforcement of some kind, and instead are buying their way into, without telling anyone, without informing anyone of what they're doing, without any real transparency there, and getting access to records that other companies are scooping up and sort of aggregating. When I pay my water bill or I pay my internet bill, I'm not clicking a box that says, yes, please send this to ICE. When I pay my cell phone bill, I'm not clicking a box and saying, yes, I'll pay my cell phone bill. And I understand that part of paying my cell phone bill is that you're going to aggregate all this data about me, and then you're going to share it with a federal enforcement agency that has the ability to detain and deport people from the country. I think that's a very different kind of relationship. It might be kind of in the same ballpark. But, when you look at the releases around the Snowden issue, I know this is ancient history in our news cycle, but the releases around the Snowden issue several years ago that showed just how much information the government's collecting, maybe even illegally, that was really concerning. There's a lot of policies. I know it's not in the United States, but there's a lot of real discussion and real policy change happening in Europe, which is gradually sort of eating away at some of these problems because people really do care about privacy there, and they're changing laws. There's the right to be forgotten law, that you have the ability legally to write to search companies and tell them, yes, I want you to unlist my old blog from 15 years ago. You have to take that stuff off. And I do see there's more discussion happening today, I think, than maybe a couple years ago in Congress. There's actual hearings, there's organizations who are, lobbying for better privacy and better protection laws. And I do think that things like this, when you see government agencies have this much access to our data with potentially really huge ramifications for people and civil rights and civil liberties, I do think that there is an opportunity here. It might be slow, and I think Americans are a little slow on the uptake when it comes to digital privacy, but I do think that we might be turning the ship a little bit.
Well, it is whenever I'm discussing with my clients these issues, sometimes our clients might do stuff that they don't want the government to know about. And inevitably, there's a question like, how would they know? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always like, well, we have to inform them about this or that or whatnot. And sometimes, most of my clients are okay, fine. But there are some clients who be like, well, how would they know? And I'm like, oh, they know. I don't know how, like, and sometimes we're not really sure how they, like, Stephen, how many times have you had a client who's like tried to like pull one over on the government, and for things that legitimately you would think they're never going to know, but they know. So it's a good tale to kind of emphasize to our clients, like, they know. Just assume that they know everything, because they probably know more than they'll even tell you.
That's right.
Yeah. It's sort of funny to me too, because it's actually people who are more conservative on the political spectrum who have a sort of inherent distrust of government, big government and like spying on us, that kind of thing. I mean, ironically, like privacy kinds of issues should make a lot of sense to people who sort of fall that place on the spectrum. I mean, would you put a tracking device on your car that allowed police to ticket you every time you went over the speed limit? I think most people would be appalled at that idea and sort of somewhat terrified to have the police tracking them wherever they go. Effectively, that's the kind of level of invasiveness that constant electronic monitoring allows for people, allows ICE to do.
It's a very American thing, right? To only worry about
your own privacy.
Or impinge.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Now, others, like, oh, not so much. I was going to say conservatives, but I don't think conservatives are alone in that. I think that's kind of an American thing.
It's very American.
One thing I'm trying to wrap my head around, we talked last week about this Doyle memo where the immigration court or ICE litigation and the immigration court is trying really hard to reduce the backlog, 1.5 million cases in immigration court. And so they are going on this massive dismissal. I don't know what you want to call it. They're trying to dismiss all these cases and take probably hundreds of thousands of people who will be undocumented once their case is dismissed, with no requirement on the back end that they check in, that they do anything. And that's all in the service of reducing the backload in the immigration court. At the same time, you have this sort of unrelenting monitoring happening to other groups of people. And there doesn't seem to be any strategy or theory behind like how these different parts of ICE should be doing their job, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I feel this way about the dedicated docket. I feel the same way about a lot of programs that Republican and Democratic presidents have instituted. It's a lot of like looking busy because no one really wants to solve the problem, and Congress doesn't want to solve the problem. They don't want to do anything right now anyway, but nobody actually wants to address the systemic problem. So people look busy, and most of what it does is just create a bunch of confusion for everyone who actually works in the system. But I just don't see it solving anything. I will say, though, the one thing that has changed with the electronic monitoring program is because so many people who are in the program are now using the smartphone app, SmartLink. I'm sure both of you have clients who are on this. This has allowed the agency to scale their electronic monitoring in a way that they never could before. In fact, there's fewer people today on GPS ankle monitors than there have been in years, maybe 10 years. Less than 20,000, according to the numbers that came out this week. So first time it's been less than 20,000 in years and years and years. All of the growth is happening with the smartphone app. And I'm not trying to make any wild projections here, but I just don't see any barriers to scalability. So they've been able to add so many people, 266,000 people now. What's going to keep them from putting essentially everyone who's either waiting for an immigration case or has had theirs dismissed? I just don't see any limit in terms of scalability to the app. So I wouldn't be surprised if 5 to 10 years, again, if BI can have the staff to do the work. They, by the way, the staff at the company that contracts for this and monitors all these people in the smartphone app, I went and looked at all their company reviews yesterday, myself and a research intern, and everyone's just like pissed. They just hate working at BI because it's like poor management. There's no room for advancement. The caseloads are unmanageable. They keep increasing the caseloads like really rapidly. The only thing that they said was you get free Coke. Apparently, there's like a soda fountain, so
Coke?
you can.
Oh, soda fountain.
Coca-Cola. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There's a meth lab in the back. Don't worry about it.
I feel a lot of our listeners are maybe more on the progressive or liberal side word we're using now. And so I just want to do a translation of this last bit of information you gave us for how a conservative would view it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be Austin now. So what Biden is essentially doing is giving all illegals smartphone. There you go. And period.
Right.
That's
right.
That was it. I just sized your entire presentation today to Biden's giving illegals smartphones. So
yeah,
that's all they'll hear
with no loss of clarity or accuracy. So that was great.
No, that's pretty much it.
Right. They actually use their own phones. They don't even get free phones, right? I mean, as far as I know, I've never known anyone.
No, they're getting phones, right?
They do now. Yeah, they have been given restricted. The phones can't.
What?
It's not like they're handing out like iPhone 13s and like.
I'm a conservative now. This is bullshit.
So what I just thought about as you were talking, a guy was in yesterday and he was showing me one of these phones.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, oh my God, I should really have these people leave these phones outside of the consultation.
Oh, that's a really interesting point.
Oh, you absolutely should.
Thought about it. I'm like, yeah, so.
Really interesting.
Practice pointer.
Yeah.
I've been doing most of my appointments by phone.
Oh, okay.
So that's also probably not great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, man. This is giving me a lot to think about.
I think there's a lot for lawyers to think about here. And, one of the issues here is, so we've read over myself and an intern, we've gone over terms of service that these apps provide and things like that. And one of the things that I get asked a lot is the app tracking people, their locations, the same way that the GPS ankle monitors did? Are they tracking location all the time? ICE has said on several occasions that they're not tracking location constantly. It's just when you check in. And that may be true.
And that settles the issue.
And that settles the issue.
They said so.
They never lie. But here's the issue. There is no transparency around this program. And so even if that's true today, if they changed that policy or that practice or that switch tomorrow, we know that smartphones and apps are fully capable of tracking you constantly if it wants to. So if they were to change that tomorrow, even if we take them at their word today, how would any of us know? There is no mechanism for disclosure. There is no oversight body. There is no one that looks into this. There's no obligation on their part to tell us. And so even if that's true today, part of the problem here is it's not just the scaling of this program to hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million people. There's 1.8 million people. I looked at the number this morning. We're going to release data later today on this from Track that show there's 1.8 million people in removal proceedings right now. So that's a lot of people that could be tracked. But it's also, how is the technology going to advance and how will the public know about those changes? There's also concerns, as you are both pointing out, I think are very real, about, okay, if your client is using that app, if they're texting you on the app, if they're calling you on the app, if the app is in the room, how is that app being used? Is there a problem with that when it comes to attorney-client privilege and other privacy issues? I don't know that the app is, has access to the microphone. I don't know what the security features are on the phones that the government's, handing out, but none of us do. And there isn't clarity around that. And there really needs to be. So I think even if we are still in the phase where we're kind of learning what the technology is and where it's going, now's the time to start pushing for these transparency measures before we get to the point where, all of a sudden when someone breaks this story and we learn, actually ICE has had access. Because by the way, ICE has, and private detention contractors have listened in on attorney-client calls. We know this. Clients who have been in detention centers and called out to talk to their attorneys on the phone, those calls have been recorded and listened to even when they weren't supposed to. There's a big lawsuit about this last year. So we know it's not beyond the agency or its contractors to do this, even when they're not supposed to.
One last thing, because I know you guys at Track, you monitor, immigration court stuff. Is it maybe too early to see if there's been any effect on the numbers by the implementation of the Doyle memo with all the dismissals going on?
We haven't looked into that. I'll raise that to the team so that maybe we can have a look at that this summer at some point and give the public some more data to really look at that. But we haven't looked at that yet. No. So it's hard to say.
Yeah. I mean, it is a very, as Stephen was saying, a very ad hoc. And we talked about all across the country, there are different ways of handling it. Seeing some loads are being like dismissed en masse and others are not.
Mm-hmm.
But it'd be interesting to see because this is like one of their solutions. And what about the dedicated docket? Do you guys have any data on that and how that's going?
Yeah, we have. We looked really closely at that. We wrote a report back in December, and then we recently worked with UCLA, some really great researchers out at UCLA Law School, to look really closely at the dedicated docket. And by and large, it's just not accomplishing what the Biden administration claimed that it was going to. They said, we're going to pick a couple of main courts. We're going to make sure that people have access to services, and attorneys and all of this. And what we found is, well, first of all, people are not getting representation at any higher rates than any other groups, at least not yet. Maybe that will change over time, but not yet. And then we're also finding that actually the majority of cases have been completed, have ended in deportation pretty quickly.
So I just had a dedicated docket hearing yesterday. It's for a woman who entered in July of last year, and we're having her final asylum hearing yesterday, which is very quick, and especially in immigration court terms, so less than a year.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to give away the location or anything because I think the judge and the government attorney, one of the factors in them being so sympathetic to the case was kind of how fast the woman was being pushed through the process. And the case was granted, and probably a case that normally would not be granted. But the government attorney and the judge were, I think, really sympathetic to. There were some issues where I talked about, like, look, we didn't really have time to do this, especially for her child, for SIJ, the special immigrant juvenile status. And of course, when you compress the time, lots of times my fees are always paid over time. My fees are not really all that high, but still, a single mom from Central America is not going to have a lot of money.
Right.
So say, okay, you can pay over time, and then it's compressed, so they feel they have to pay more. And then if they have to do other things. So they're really sympathetic to that. And I think it might be only specific to this one judge in this location I'm not going to mention, but it worked out. It worked out for my client, but
that's good.
It's really hard to put on a case, I'll be honest, in that short of time. And everyone will say, oh, you had a year. But obviously, it's not the only case I'm working on. Like, we have a whole bunch of other cases going on. And, we have to kind of juggle our priorities. And then especially if the client has to do things, outside of the immigration court, or maybe do counseling, try to get letters, it's really hard to put on a case that quickly. And also, a lot of people go through a lot of trauma, so it takes them time. I've had clients where it's taken 2 to 3 years for them to kind of go through therapy and get to a point where they can talk about things. But yeah, the dedicated docket is like the rocket docket from Obama. George Bush had something similar when I first started. It's kind of like people's New Year's resolution. Like, it's really good. Maybe January, February, March, you slow down, but you're still kind of on track. April, you're doing okay. And by May or June.
Who on earth has ever made it to April on a New Year's resolution? I mean, your example is absurd. January 3rd, starting to struggle. January 4th, that's the analogy.
That was it.
Yeah.
Well, luckily, the rocket docket, even though they've tried it a bunch of times, it does fix everything every time they try it. So
that's what me and Austin were just talking. Stephen was away, so he didn't hear our conversation.
Oh, sorry.
That was exactly what we were talking about, how, like, the dedicated docket is perfect. It's everything. Well, everything will be solved.
I think my favorite part of, we looked at the data on this back in December, and then again more recently, but I don't know if it's just, you get to some point where you find things like this funny, but like 10% of the hearings that had happened at the time that we looked at the data had been dismissed because ICE hadn't even filed anything with the court. So people are going into court and the courts are just like, we don't know what's happening. So I don't know. That's like another funny part to me where these institutions cannot keep up with each other. They cannot work together. ICE can't get their paperwork into court in time. The courts can't process it in time. So like I wrote about this at the very beginning of the Trump administration. I wrote this book chapter or something about what I called like judicial acceleration. This idea that there's a politics around like, well, just hurry up. We'll just have these programs that'll make things happen really fast. We'll just move these cases really quickly through the courts and that'll be great. We'll just speed everything up. And it's like, not only is that not good necessarily for due process and for people in the system, the government agencies are not designed to respond to things quickly and to like do things quickly. So it's just not a good idea. It's like there's just like this incapacity to think, okay, we need actually like a 10-year plan. We don't need a 300-day plan. We don't need like, oh, we're going to squeeze all these cases through in 300 days and that'll solve it. We need to think at a decade. It took us decades to get here. It's going to take us at least, but no one can think that long because people have to run for re-election. So.
The thing is, they would be a lot more successful if they wanted to try to accelerate cases to dispose of them, if they worked with the private bar, like me and Steven, to work on cases that can easily be stipulated to, and that they had it in their mind that they could stipulate. Because, there are times we have asylum clients walk in and within 5 to 10 minutes, we know this is a really good case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a case that's really should no doubt be granted. Or something like cancellation. We have someone who walks in, they've been in the country for 20 years. They have 6 U.S. citizen children. 3 of them have very severe autism, or one of them has cancer, something like that. Those are cases that we know that we could put together and they could get disposed of very quickly. So I think they look at it from the wrong way, because you're going to try to dispose of a case of mine that might not be the strongest. I'm going to need more time to build that case. So I'm going to resist that. Like in the Doyle, Stephen talked about, in the Doyle memo, it talks about stipulating to relief, right? And that's like the part they kind of skipped over for the most part, but that would be something that would have a much better chance of, clearing backlogs and anything else. But
I'll just say, taking a step back, 20,000-foot view, it's crazy that we have a labor shortage, especially in the industries that immigrants could easily fill. I'm in an agricultural area. There's been a labor shortage as long as I've lived here. We have people here who are willing to do the work legitimately. They want work permits. They want to pay taxes. And not only do we not let them do it legitimately, but we don't let them do it legitimately, knowing they're doing it illegitimately. And now we're also monitoring them in this sort of dystopian way. I always sort of hesitate to use the slavery comparison. It's not the same thing, but it's starting to look, in certain ways like Maria has to work. She also has to come home on Thursdays to take a picture of herself in the living room so that ICE doesn't know that she's picking potatoes or whatever. And she's cut off from all of our social safety nets, the basic services that we all depend on. She's paid a depressed wage because of her illegitimate status. And so, these things, on the one hand, it's easy to say they're not working. And on the other hand, like they kind of do work exactly as they're meant to from a certain perspective. So very frustrating.
They're broken in the way they're supposed to be. And actually, let me just plug a concept here, which I think I've found really useful for talking about kind of exactly what you're talking about, Stephen, which is Ruha Benjamin is just this amazing author I read a lot. She writes a lot about race and technology. And she wrote a book, and the subtitle is The New Jim Code. So instead of The New Jim Crow, which is Michelle Alexander's book about the way in which race still plays a role in the criminal justice system, she coins this phrase, the new Jim Code, to talk about the way that technology and racism work together in our very contemporary world, and the way that algorithms and all these monitoring technologies can actually work to reinforce racial stratification, which ties into issues of labor, which again, she's very careful to say, it's not like it's the same system as, slavery in the 1800s, but it has an aspect of that, which is it is a disciplinary kind of technology that regulates people's lives. It regulates their labor participation, they work for less wages. And they also live a life that, even though it is nominally in the cities that we live in as well, in the states that we live in as well, their geography of everyday life is very, very different. Their mobility, where they can go, where they feel comfortable going, especially if you're wearing an ankle monitor, that big bulky ankle monitor. Are you going to walk into a Starbucks or a coffee shop? I mean, how are people going to look at you? There's issues with stigmatization around this as well. And the smartphone itself is maybe better from that perspective, but it doesn't get rid of it. So anyway, to anyone wanting to, think more about that or read more about that, or that concept, the new Jim Code is one that I think about and sort of stuck with me.
Awesome. Well, Austin Kocher from Track, thank you so much for joining us. How can people follow you?
Syracuse. Woo!
Go Syracuse. Yeah, we're always updating data on our website. So track.syr.edu is obviously we're posting stuff on there today, the detention data and the electronic monitoring data that I referenced. I'm also on Twitter at ACKocher, ACKOCHER, and I also write on Substack as well at austinkocher.substack.com.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Good conversation.
All right, guys. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, y'all.